Welcome to the 24MX workshop. I'm Charlie Frost, and on today's episode, I'm going to show you how to change the front sprocket on the bike and also when it's necessary to do so. So I'm going to show you how to change the front sprocket on the KTM. It's very crucial knowing when to change the front sprocket and what time to change it. I normally say that when the front sprocket is starting to hook around the front here, you'll know that that's time, because in future it can stretch the chain and also it can lead to further damage and also the chain derailing itself from the rear sprocket. So I'm going to show you step by step how to remove and change the front sprocket on the bike. Firstly, I'm going to slacken off the rear wheel. By doing that, that'll give me a lot more movement on the chain in order to remove the front sprocket from the chain guide. So firstly, we're going to loosen off the rear wheel. So using a 32mm socket. Going to give that a crack. So I'm going to take the rear wheel nut off completely to give myself movement on the spindle, like so. I'm not going to remove the spindle the whole way. I'm only going to remove it enough so the adjuster moves from there, allowing me to push the wheel forward, creating slack on the chain, which then allows me to remove the chain off of the rear sprocket, like so. But I'm going to leave that as it is. So now I've got movement in here to get the front sprocket off. So next step is to remove this 8mm bolt, which will allow me to move the chain guide up, give me more movement to work with the front sprocket. So we get an 8mm socket. So using an extension bar and 8mm socket head. We're going to remove the bolt. Like so. So now I've got a lot more area to work with, and obviously I can get the chain off when I need to. So the next step will be to loosen off the 17mm bolt holding the front sprocket in place. A 17mm socket head and also an extension bar. Now normally this will be very tight, which it should be, because obviously the front sprocket is always moving. So we're going to use the socket. You can use an impact gun if you've got one, which makes it a lot easier. But if not, I can show another method shortly of how I would get the front bolt removed if you haven't got an impact gun. But for now, we'll just loosen this bolt, like so. It's also important when reinstating the bolt that you don't cross thread it and also strip the thread on the bolt, but I'll show you that shortly. So you've got your washer and your bolt. As you can see, it's got a lot of dry residue on it from the previous thread lock, so we'll give that a clean off before we put the bolt back on. Leave that down there. So now by removing the bolt, that allows us to slide the front sprocket off, like so, and then removing the old sprocket, like so. And as you can see around here, it's still nice and clean, but we can give it a grease up or give it a bit of lubrication just to give it a nice clean off. And also we'll clean out any more residue that's left in the thread from the previous thread lock. So that's the old sprocket, leave that down there. And then grabbing our new 20 front sprocket, like so. Now, sometimes people will change just the sprockets, because if the chain is still in half decent condition, it's not really worth changing it. But some people will change front, rear sprocket and chain together. And sometimes, like I said, if the chain's not in half bad condition, you can leave it and just change the sprockets. But for now, we're just going to change the front sprocket on this one. So with the chain nice and slack here, we'll put the sprocket into the chain, because by putting the sprocket into the chain first, it makes it easier to fit the sprocket onto the spline. So we'll give ourselves enough slack here, slot the sprocket down into the chain, feeding it round link by link, like so. So now it's sat in the chain properly, and then we'll slide it onto the spline, like so. Slide it on, make sure it's pushed back nice and firm, like that. So as you can see, the chain is now nice and secure in there. And like I said, we'll just give it a bit of a clean inside of there, give it a spray of some grease, and then we'll also give the old bolt a bit of a wipe down. You can replace these every single time you change the front sprocket, but if the bolt's still in good nick and you use thread lock provided, you can reuse the old bolt, it's not a problem. So we'll just grab some A9 Racing Oils all-in-one spray and a rag. So like I said, just give it a nice squirt inside there, just to give it a clean up of any debris, so it's nice and clean. Same again with the old bolt, just give it a nice clean off. Getting rid of any excess thread lock and dirt, like so. And also just to give the old washer, as you can see, it's got a bit of dirt and grease around there. Give that a nice wipe off. Like I said, you can reuse these parts unless they're very worn, but these aren't too bad, so you can use them again. So with the old bolt and washer, what we're going to do is going to use some thread lock, because it's important to make sure that the bolt is nice and tight and secure inside the spline. So it's just put halfway to the top, like so. You don't want to put too much on the bolt because it'll be too messy. If you put just half of that on, like I said, as you're doing the bolt in, the thread lock will spread itself out across the whole bolt and the whole way around. So we'll now insert the bolt into the thread, like so, but making sure the bolt is nice and straight when doing it up, because if you put the bolt in on an angle, you don't want to strip the thread and then obviously cause the bolt to snap in future reference. So making sure the bolt is nice and straight and square with this washer. We'll use the 17mm socket to do it back up. And what you want to make sure is that when you're doing this back up, that the washer is sat on the bolt properly, because I've seen a lot of people put the bolt back in, the washer sat on an angle, and they think it's done up nice and tight, but it's not. So making sure that washer is sat on the bolt properly, and then you'll see that there's a little gap just situated here, a tiny little gap between the washer and the bolt. When that's nice and pushed up against each other, you'll know that the bolt's in properly. I've seen many people do the bolt back up thinking it's in straight, but actually there's a little gap there. So as you'll see, as I tighten up now, that gap is now gone, which means that bolt is in properly. And that is now nice and tight with the washer and the bolt. So that front sprocket is now nice and secure. And then we'll put the chain guide back into place. Same again, we'll put a bit of thread lock on this bolt just to keep it nice and secure when it's back in place. And filling only half of the thread again, like so. You don't need too much, just a little bit to make it nice and tight. So same again, making sure that bolt is nice and straight in the thread. Do that back up nice and tight, like so. So now that the front sprocket is nice and tight, and also the chain guide bolt is nice and tight, we're now going to put the chain back onto the sprocket and do the rear wheel back up. And I'll show you one last little tip I do before I make sure everything is tight. So making sure the bike is in neutral so that the front sprocket can move freely. I'm now going to put the chain back onto the rear sprocket, like so. And then make sure that the wheel is pulled back, so we've got a nice tight chain again. Putting the spindle back in place with the adjuster, that's in there. And then pretty much final step, putting the adjuster and the wheel nut back onto the bike. Making sure that the adjuster is up to the bolt like that. And also, like I showed you in previous episode, the spanner trick. So we're gonna put the spanner into the sprocket, like so, and then pulling the wheel backwards. By doing that, it will pull the wheel forwards into the adjuster, so it's nice and tight. So we can leave that there, hold the wheel with your left hand, and then plain and simple, tighten the wheel nut back up, then remove the spanner, making sure the wheel is nice and freely moving. And then one last check of the wheel nut is nice and tight. So that was to show you how to change the front sprocket on the bike. In future episodes, I will show you how to change the chain and also the rear sprocket on the bike. All products can be found on the 24MX website. I'm Charlie Frost, and I'll see you on the next one.